The bullet tore through the saloon window, just as Adelaide Jameson pressed her back against the door frame, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her corset. She had arrived in Laramie, Wyoming only 3 hours ago, stepping off the Union Pacific with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a letter from her dead aunt, only to find herself in the middle of a shootout between rival cattle outfits disputing water rights. The year was 1878, and the frontier town still carried that raw edge of lawlessness that made every stranger either a potential friend or enemy. Adelaide ducked lower as another shot rang out, pressing her palms against the rough wooden planks. She had traveled all the way from Boston after her Aunt Martha passed, leaving her a small homestead just outside town. At 23, Adelaide had nothing left in the East except memories of a failed engagement to a banker's son who decided she was too outspoken, too independent, too much of everything he did not want in a wife. So she had taken her inheritance and headed west, hoping to start fresh where nobody knew her family's slow descent into poverty after her father's shipping business collapsed. The gunfire stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk. Adelaide peered around the doorframe and saw a tall figure in a dusty duster coat walking down the center of the street. His hands relaxed at his sides, despite the tension that hung in the air like smoke. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and even from this distance, she could see the confidence in his stride. "That is enough," the man called out, his voice carrying across the street with quiet authority. "Next man who fires a shot answers to me, and I promise you will not like how that conversation ends." Adelaide watched as men on both sides of the dispute lowered their weapons. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "This is not your fight, Kane." "It is when you shoot up my town," the tall man replied. "Now get out of here before I lose my patience." The men dispersed slowly, muttering among themselves but clearly unwilling to challenge the stranger. Adelaide found herself staring at the man they called Kane as he turned and walked toward the saloon. He moved with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin, and when he looked up, she caught a glimpse of pale blue eyes beneath the brim of his hat. He stopped when he saw her in the doorway. "You picked a hell of a day to arrive in Laramie, miss." Adelaide straightened, brushing dust from her dark blue traveling dress. "I did not exactly have a choice in the matter. The train does not run on my schedule." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his weathered face. He was younger than she had first thought, probably no more than 27 or 28, with dark stubble along his jaw and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. "Fair point. You staying at the hotel?" "I am looking for the Jameson homestead," Adelaide said, lifting her chin despite the way her hands still trembled. "I am Adelaide Jameson. My Aunt Martha left me her property." The amusement faded from his expression, replaced by something that looked like sympathy. "Martha Jameson was your aunt." "You knew her." "Everyone knew Martha. She was a good woman." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "The homestead is about 5 miles outside town. It has been empty since she passed 2 months ago." Adelaide felt a chill despite the summer heat. 2 months. "But I only received the letter 3 weeks ago. Mail takes time out here." He studied her for a moment, then seemed to come to some decision. "Look, miss, I do not mean to speak ill of your aunt, but that homestead has seen better days. Maybe you should stay in town tonight, get your bearings before you head out there." "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Kane Jennings, Mr. Jennings," Adelaide continued, meeting his eyes directly. "But I have traveled 2,000 miles to get here, and I am not about to spend money on a hotel when I have a perfectly good house waiting for me." Kane's jaw tightened slightly. It is going to be dark in a few hours, and the road out there is not exactly safe for a woman traveling alone. Then I had better get started. Adelaide picked up her carpet bag and stepped fully out of the doorway. Could you direct me to someone who might rent me a horse and wagon? He stared at her for a long moment, and Adelaide refused to look away. She had dealt with plenty of men who thought they knew what was best for her, and she was not about to start taking orders now. Finally, Kane sighed and shook his head. I will take you myself. My horse can handle double, and I have supplies to pick up out that way anyway. Adelaide wanted to refuse on principle, but practicality won out. She had never ridden a horse in her life, let alone driven a wagon, and the thought of attempting it alone as darkness fell was more daunting than she wanted to admit. That is very kind of you. Kind has nothing to do with it, Kane said, but his tone had softened. Martha was good to me when I first came to Laramie. Figure I owe her at least this much. 20 minutes later, Adelaide found herself seated behind Kane on a large bay gelding, her carpetbag tied to the saddle. She had initially tried to keep some distance between them, but the horse's gait made that impossible, and eventually she had no choice but to hold onto Kane's waist to keep from sliding off. She could feel the solid warmth of him through his shirt, and despite herself, she found it oddly comforting after the chaos of her arrival. You from back east? Kane asked as they rode out of town. Boston, Adelaide confirmed. I suppose it is obvious. The dress is a bit fancy for Laramie, but that is not a bad thing. We could use some refinement around here. There was a hint of humor in his voice now. What made you decide to come west? Most Boston ladies I have met would rather die than leave civilization. Adelaide watched the landscape roll by, the endless expanse of grassland dotted with sagebrush and wildflowers. There was nothing left for me there. My father passed 5 years ago, my mother 2 years after that. I was engaged briefly, but that ended badly. When Aunt Martha's letter arrived, it felt like a sign, running from something or toward something. The question caught her off guard with its insight. Both, I suppose. Is that why you came here? Running or seeking? Kane was quiet for a moment. Bit of both. I grew up in Kansas, worked cattle drives for a few years before settling here. Laramie is rough around the edges, but it is honest. A man can make something of himself if he is willing to work for it. And what have you made of yourself, Mr. Jennings? I have a small ranch about 10 miles north of your aunt's place. Not much yet, but it is mine. No banknotes, no one to answer to except myself. There was pride in his voice, the kind that came from hard-won achievement. And it is Kane. No need for formalities out here. Adelaide found herself relaxing slightly against him. Then you should call me Adelaide. The ride took longer than she expected, following a dirt road that wound through rolling hills covered in prairie grass. The sun was sinking toward the horizon when they finally crested a rise, and Kane pulled the horse to a stop. There it is, he said quietly. Adelaide looked down at the small homestead in the valley below, and her heart sank. The house was little more than a cabin, its roof sagging on one side. The barn looked even worse, with several boards missing from the walls. The fence around what must have been a garden was broken in multiple places, and weeds had overtaken everything. I should have warned you, Kane said. Martha was sick for a long time before she passed. She could not keep up with the maintenance. Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes but refused to let them fall. She had expected something humble, but this was worse than she had imagined. Still, it was hers and she had nowhere else to go. It is fine. I can fix it up. Kane twisted in the saddle to look back at her, and his expression was gentler than she expected. Adelaide, I am not trying to discourage you, but this is going to take more than a woman alone can handle. The roof needs replacing, The barn is practically falling down, and winter comes early and hard in Wyoming. If you do not have everything buttoned up tight by October, you will freeze." "Then I will work quickly," Adelaide said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "I did not come all this way to give up before I even start." Something shifted in Kane's eyes, a flicker of respect or perhaps recognition. He nodded slowly. "All right then. Let us get you settled for the night." The inside of the cabin was marginally better than the outside, though a thick layer of dust covered everything. There was a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and a small cooking area with a cast iron stove. Adelaide set down her carpetbag and looked around, trying to see the potential beneath the neglect. Kane checked the chimney while Adelaide examined the stove. "Flue is clear, at least. You will be able to build a fire tonight without smoking yourself out." "That is something," Adelaide said, forcing brightness into her tone. Kane crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "I am going to say something, and I want you to hear me out before you get your back up." Adelaide turned to face him, already bracing herself. "Go on." "You need help. Real help. Not just a man riding by every few days to check on you. This place needs at least 2 months of solid work before it is livable, and that is assuming nothing major breaks. You do not know the land, you do not know the weather patterns, and you sure as hell do not know how to defend yourself if trouble comes calling." "I am not helpless," Adelaide said sharply. "I never said you were, but being capable and being prepared are 2 different things." Kane pushed off from the door frame and stepped closer. "I am offering to help you. I can come by every morning, put in a few hours of work before heading back to my own place. In exchange, once you get on your feet, you can help me with my books. I am decent with cattle but terrible with paperwork." Adelaide studied him suspiciously. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" "Because Martha would haunt me if I left her niece to struggle alone, and because—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Because everyone needs help sometimes. That does not make you weak. It just makes you human." The kindness in his voice was almost harder to bear than the state of the homestead. Adelaide felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "I cannot pay you. Did not ask you to." Kane's pale blue eyes held hers steadily. "What do you say?" Adelaide wanted to refuse. She had come west to prove she could stand on her own, to build a life that did not depend on anyone else. But she was also practical enough to know that pride would not repair a roof or fix a broken barn. "All right. But I insist on cooking you breakfast every morning you are here. That is only fair." A genuine smile crossed Kane's face, transforming it from merely handsome to something that made Adelaide's breath catch. "That is a deal I will happily take. I have been living on burned bacon and stale bread for 6 months." They spent the next hour making the cabin habitable for the night. Kane brought in firewood from a covered pile behind the house while Adelaide swept and wiped down surfaces. She found sheets in a trunk at the foot of the bed, dusty but intact, and managed to make up the bed while Kane got a fire going. "There is a well out back," Kane said as darkness fell. "Water is good. I tested it myself last month. You have got enough firewood to last a few weeks, but we will need to cut more before winter. The privy is behind the barn, and watch out for snakes." Adelaide suppressed a shudder. "Snakes, of course." Kane's lips twitched. "Welcome to Wyoming." He left shortly after, promising to return at dawn. Adelaide stood in the doorway and watched him ride away, his silhouette gradually disappearing into the gathering darkness. Then she closed the door, dropped the bar into place, and finally let herself sink onto one of the chairs. The reality of her situation crashed over her all at once. She was alone in a falling-down cabin in the middle of nowhere, completely dependent on the kindness of a stranger. Every certainty she had clung to during the long journey west now seemed foolish and naive. She had thought she could handle anything, but looking around the dim cabin with its sagging roof and dusty corners, Adelaide felt utterly overwhelmed. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, staring into the fire. For the first time since leaving Boston, she let herself cry, quiet tears that tracked down her cheeks and dripped onto her dress. She cried for her parents, for her lost engagement, for the life she had left behind and the uncertain future that stretched before her. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she simply sat, watching the flames dance and feeling hollow. Eventually, exhaustion won out over despair. Adelaide changed into her nightgown, crawled under the dusty sheets, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke to the sound of hammering. Morning light streamed through the grimy window, and for a moment Adelaide could not remember where she was. Then memory returned, along with the ache of dried tears on her face. She dressed quickly in a simple cotton dress, pinned up her dark hair, and stepped outside. Kane was on the roof of the barn, stripped down to his shirt and vest, prying off damaged boards. His horse was tied to the fence post, and a wagon loaded with lumber sat nearby. He looked up when he heard the door open and called down, "Morning. Hope I did not wake you. What time is it?" Adelaide asked, shading her eyes against the sun. "About 7. I wanted to get an early start on the barn before the heat sets in." He climbed down the ladder with easy confidence. "How did you sleep?" "Well enough." Adelaide was not about to admit to her breakdown the night before. "You brought lumber. Figured we would need it. I've got credit at the mill in town." Kane pulled off his work gloves and tucked them into his belt. "Something smells good." Adelaide realized with a start that she had not even thought about breakfast. "I have not actually started cooking yet." "That is all right, I was just being hopeful," Kane grinned. "Tell you what, you get breakfast going and I will keep working. No rush." Adelaide hurried back inside, grateful for a task to focus on. She found coffee, flour, and a few other basic supplies in the pantry, along with eggs that Kane must have brought. Within 30 minutes, she had managed to produce coffee, scrambled eggs, and biscuits that were only slightly burned on the bottom. She carried the food outside on tin plates and found Kane measuring boards. "It is not fancy, but it is edible." They ate sitting on the porch steps, the morning already warming around them. Kane ate with the focused efficiency of a man who viewed food as fuel, finishing his entire plate in the time it took Adelaide to eat half of hers. "These biscuits are good," he said, picking up a second one. "Way better than mine." "The bar is apparently very low," Adelaide said dryly. Kane laughed, a warm sound that seemed to ease some of the tension she had been carrying. "Fair enough. So what did you do back in Boston, before you came here?" "I helped run my father's household after my mother passed, managed the servants, handled the accounts, planned the social calendar." Adelaide stared out at the prairie. "It all seems very pointless now." "That is good experience, though. Running a homestead is not that different, just on a smaller scale and with more physical work." "And fewer servants," Adelaide added. "And fewer servants," Kane agreed. "But the principle is the same. You plan ahead, manage your resources, adapt when things do not go as expected. You will pick it up faster than you think." They fell into a comfortable silence, drinking their coffee as the sun climbed higher. Adelaide found herself studying Kane when he was not looking, noticing the way his hair curled slightly at his collar, the fine lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, the capable strength in his hands. There was something solid about him, reliable, and after years of dealing with men who were all charm and no substance, Adelaide found it deeply appealing. "What are you thinking about?" Kane asked suddenly, catching her staring. Adelaide felt her cheeks heat, just wondering how long the barn repairs will take. If Kane noticed her lie, he was kind enough not to call her on it. A few days for the barn, another week for the house roof, then we will need to work on the fence and the garden. If we are lucky, we can get everything done before the first frost. The casual way he said, we made something warm bloom in Adelaide's chest. She barely knew this man, but already he was treating her problems as his own. Why are you really helping me, Kane? And please do not say it is just because of my aunt. Kane set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly. You want the truth, always. When I first came to Laramie, I was 22 and thought I knew everything. I bought a piece of land and tried to build a ranch from nothing, and I nearly killed myself in the process. Too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to admit when I was in over my head. He paused, his expression distant. A man named Tom Bridger found me passed out from heat exhaustion in my own field. He took me back to his place, fed me, let me recover, and then told me I was an idiot for trying to do everything alone. He helped me through that first year, taught me what I needed to know, never asked for anything in return except that I pass it on someday. What happened to him? He moved to Colorado 2 years ago to be near his daughter, but I have never forgotten what he did for me. Kane met her eyes again. So yes, partly I am helping because Martha was kind to me, but mostly I am helping because I see someone who is trying to build something, and I know how hard that is. You should not have to do it alone. Adelaide felt tears threatening again and blinked them back fiercely. Thank you, she managed. That means more than you know. Kane stood and picked up the empty plates. Come on. I will teach you how to use a hammer. If we are going to fix this place up, you need to know how to do more than cook. The next 2 weeks fell into a rhythm. Kane arrived every morning just after dawn, and they would work together until noon when the heat became oppressive. Adelaide learned how to hammer nails straight, how to measure and cut boards, how to mix mortar and stack stones. Her hands developed blisters that turned to calluses, her back ached constantly, and she fell into bed exhausted every night. But slowly, gradually, the homestead began to transform. The barn got a new roof and reinforced walls. They repaired the fence around the garden, and Adelaide planted late-season vegetables from seeds Kane brought from town. The cabin roof was patched and reinforced, and Kane installed a new door with a proper lock. Adelaide cleaned every surface until the interior actually looked lived in rather than abandoned. As they worked, they talked. Adelaide told Kane about growing up in Boston, about her father's shipping company and her mother's social ambitions, about the suffocating expectations that came with being a young woman of a certain class. Kane told her about cattle drives and sleeping under stars, about the first time he saw the Rocky Mountains and knew he could never go back to flat Kansas farmland. They talked about books they had read, places they wanted to see, dreams they had for the future. Adelaide learned that Kane had never been married but had been engaged once, to a girl named Sarah who decided at the last minute that ranch life was not for her. She learned that he played harmonica, but could not carry a tune to save his life. She learned that he had a scar on his left shoulder from a cattle stampede and another on his right hand from a knife fight he refused to discuss. She learned that he took his coffee black, could eat his weight in fried chicken, and hated lima beans with a passion that made her laugh. Kane learned that Adelaide had studied Latin and French, could recite entire Shakespeare sonnets from memory, and had once punched her cousin at a garden party for saying women should not be allowed to own property. He learned that she was terrified of spiders but would not back down from any other challenge. He learned that she sang while she cooked, hummed while she worked, and had a laugh that sounded like music. And slowly, carefully, Without either of them quite meaning for it to happen, they began to fall in love. It started small. Kane bringing Adelaide wildflowers he found on his morning ride, Adelaide saving the best biscuits for him, hands brushing as they passed tools back and forth. Long looks that lasted just a moment too long. The way Kane's face would light up when he crested the hill and saw Adelaide already outside waiting for him. The way Adelaide's heart would race when she heard his horse approaching. One evening in late August, after a particularly long day of work, Kane stayed for supper. They ate on the porch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible. Adelaide had made chicken stew and fresh bread, and Kane ate 3 helpings, praising every bite. "I could get used to this," he said, leaning back against the porch post. "To my cooking?" Adelaide asked, trying to keep her tone light even as her heart hammered. "To this. All of it." Kane gestured vaguely at the homestead, the setting sun, the comfortable silence between them. "It feels right." Adelaide set down her bowl, her hands suddenly shaking. "Kane, I need to tell you something." He straightened, his expression growing serious. "All right. I am grateful for everything you have done, more than I can possibly express. You have been kinder to me than anyone in my life, and I do not want you to think I do not appreciate it, but I need you to understand something." She took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I am not good at this. Relationships, depending on other people, letting someone close. My engagement ended because I could not be the docile, agreeable woman my fiancé wanted. I am stubborn and opinionated, and I speak my mind even when I should not. I will only disappoint you in the end." The words hung in the air between them, and Adelaide felt tears sliding down her cheeks, despite her best efforts to hold them back. She had been carrying this fear for weeks, watching the way Kane looked at her, and knowing that eventually he would see her for who she really was and realize she was not worth the effort. Kane stood slowly and crossed the porch to kneel in front of her chair. He reached up and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs, his touch impossibly gentle for hands so work-roughened. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady and absolutely certain. "Impossible. You are already everything." Adelaide's breath caught. "What? You heard me." Kane's pale blue eyes held hers with an intensity that made her feel like the only person in the world. "Everything you just described, all those qualities you think make you difficult, they are exactly what I love about you. You are strong and independent and brave enough to build a life in a place most women would run from. You work harder than any man I know, and you never complain. You are smart and funny and kind, and when you smile at me, I feel like I could build a whole ranch with my bare hands." "Kane," Adelaide whispered, her voice breaking. "I am not your ex-fiancée, Adelaide. I am not looking for some quiet, obedient woman who will do what she is told and never have an original thought. I am looking for a partner, someone who will stand beside me and build something real. And that is you. That has always been you, from the moment you refused to let me tell you what to do on the day you arrived." Adelaide let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You think you know me, but we have only known each other a few weeks." "I have known you long enough to know you are it for me," Kane said simply. "And I am willing to spend the rest of my life proving it to you if that is what it takes." "That is completely irrational," Adelaide said, even as her heart soared. "Probably. But I have never been good at rational when it comes to things that matter." Kane took her hands in his, cradling them carefully. "I love you, Adelaide Jameson. I love your stubbornness and your strength and the way you hum when you think no one is listening. I love how you face every challenge head-on, even when you are terrified. I love the way you laugh and the way you cry and everything in between. And I would consider it the greatest honor of my life if you would let me love you for the rest of our days." Adelaide stared at him, this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known to say. She had come west expecting loneliness and struggle, expecting to carve out a life alone through sheer force of will. She had not expected Kane, with his quiet strength and steady presence. She had not expected to find someone who saw all her sharp edges and rough places and loved her not despite them but because of them. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have loved you since the day you took me riding out here, even though I was too scared to admit it." Kane's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. He stood, pulling her up with him, and then his arms were around her and his lips were on hers. Adelaide kissed him back with everything she had, pouring weeks of longing and fear and hope into that single moment. He tasted like sunshine and coffee and home, and when they finally broke apart, Adelaide was breathless and dizzy and completely certain that she had made the right choice in coming west. "Marry me," Kane said against her hair. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. Say you will marry me." "Yes," Adelaide said without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They stood on the porch wrapped in each other's arms as the stars came out, and Adelaide felt something settle deep in her soul. This was what home felt like. Not a place, but a person. Not the cabin or the land, but Kane and the future they would build together. The next morning, Kane arrived earlier than usual with a tin box under his arm. Adelaide was already up, making coffee, and she raised an eyebrow when she saw the box. "What is that?" "My mother's ring." Kane set the box on the table and opened it, revealing a simple gold band with a small ruby. "It is not much, but it was hers, and she would have wanted you to have it." Adelaide picked up the ring with trembling fingers. It was beautiful in its simplicity, the gold worn smooth with age, the ruby deep red like garnets. "Kane, I cannot take your mother's ring." "Why not? You are going to be my wife." Kane took the ring from her and slid it onto her left hand. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. "There. Now it is official." Adelaide stared at the ring on her finger, feeling the weight of it, the promise it represented. "When did you decide to ask me?" "Last night on the porch, the day you refused to let me boss you around," Kane admitted. "I did not know it then, but looking back, that was the moment. You were so fierce and determined, and I thought to myself, there is a woman who knows her own mind. I wanted to know you better, wanted to see what else was hiding behind all that strength." "And what did you find?" Kane pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Everything I did not know I was looking for." They spent that morning working on the garden fence, but Adelaide could not stop glancing at the ring on her finger. Every time the light caught the ruby, she felt a surge of joy so intense it almost hurt. She had thought herself unlovable, thought her independence made her unfit for marriage, but Kane had shown her that the right person would love her not despite her strength, but because of it. As they worked, they made plans. They would marry in Laramie at the small church on Main Street. Kane had a few friends in town who would serve as witnesses, and Adelaide would make her own dress from fabric they would buy at the general store. They would combine their homesteads, using Adelaide's cabin as a base while they built a proper house on Kane's land. They talked about children, about how many they wanted, and when they might start trying. They talked about expanding the ranch, about buying more cattle and maybe some horses. They talked about growing old together, about grandchildren and rocking chairs and all the years stretching out before them. "I want at least 3 children," Adelaide said as they hammered fence posts. "I was an only child, and it was terribly lonely." "3 sounds good," Kane agreed. "Maybe 4, I always wanted a big family." "4," Adelaide repeated, trying to imagine it. "We will need a bigger house. We will build it together. Everything we do from now on, we do together." Kane looked over at her and grinned. "Though I am putting you in charge of the bookkeeping." I meant what I said about being terrible with paperwork. And I am putting you in charge of anything that involves heights, Adelaide said firmly. I nearly fell off the barn roof twice last week. Deal. They worked until the heat drove them inside, and then spent the afternoon planning the layout of their new house. Kane drew rough sketches on paper Adelaide provided, showing her where the kitchen would go, where the bedrooms would be, how they could add on as the family grew. Adelaide suggested a front porch wide enough for rocking chairs, and Kane added a back porch for summer evenings. They argued good-naturedly about details, compromising and adjusting until they had something that felt right. As September arrived, they set a date for the wedding, October 15th, just before the weather turned. That gave them 6 weeks to finish the most critical repairs on the homestead and make preparations. Adelaide sewed her dress in the evenings by lamplight, using cream-colored silk she splurged on at the general store. It was simple but elegant, with long sleeves and a fitted bodice, the kind of dress she could wear again for special occasions. Kane built them a proper bed frame to replace the narrow cot in the cabin, joking that they would need something sturdier for married life. He repaired the barn door and installed new shelves in the cabin. He brought Adelaide to his ranch one Sunday and showed her around, letting her see the house he had built with his own hands, the barn where he kept his horses, the fields where his cattle grazed. It was beautiful and rustic and full of potential, and Adelaide could see their future written in every corner. They told the people in town about their engagement, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. The general store owner, a motherly woman named Ruth, took Adelaide under her wing and gave her advice about surviving Wyoming winters. The blacksmith, a gruff man named Henry, congratulated Kane and offered to make them horseshoes as a wedding present. Even the sheriff, a weathered old cowboy named Morgan, seemed pleased, telling Kane he had chosen well. Adelaide wrote letters to distant cousins back in Boston, informing them of her engagement. She did not expect them to make the journey for the wedding, but she wanted them to know she was happy, that her gamble on coming west had paid off. She wondered what they would think of Kane, with his rough hands and easy smile, so different from the polished businessmen they would have expected her to marry. She decided she did not care. Their opinions had never mattered much to her anyway. As the wedding approached, Kane spent more and more time at Adelaide's cabin, often staying until well after dark. They maintained propriety, never spending the night under the same roof, but they pushed the boundaries of what was considered proper. They would sit on the porch wrapped in a single blanket, talking and kissing until the stars wheeled overhead. Kane taught Adelaide to shoot, setting up targets in the yard and patiently correcting her aim until she could hit a can from 20 paces. Adelaide taught Kane to dance, humming waltzes while they spun around the small cabin, laughing when they crashed into furniture. One evening in early October, as they sat by the fire after supper, Kane pulled Adelaide onto his lap and buried his face in her hair. "I cannot wait to marry you. 6 more days feels like 6 years. Adelaide ran her fingers through his hair, marveling at how natural this felt, how right. "I know, but we have waited this long. We can wait a little longer." "Can we, though?" Kane kissed her neck, making her shiver. "Because I am not sure I can." "Kane," Adelaide said, though her protest was weak, "we should wait. It is only proper." "Proper is overrated," Kane murmured against her skin. "And we are already engaged. What difference does a week make?" Adelaide knew she should insist they maintain propriety. That was what she had been taught all her life. But she was tired of following rules that did not make sense, tired of denying what she wanted because society said she should. She loved Kane, completely and without reservation, and she saw no reason to wait for a ceremony to express that love. "No difference at all," she whispered. And then she was kissing him and he was kissing her back, and the fire crackled beside them as they gave in to what they had been fighting for weeks. Later, lying in the narrow bed with Kane's arm around her and her head on his chest, Adelaide felt a peace she had never known before. This was what it meant to belong to someone, not in a possessive way but in the way of two souls recognizing each other. She traced patterns on Kane's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers. "No regrets?" Kane asked quietly. "Not a single one," Adelaide said. Just that I did not do this weeks ago." Kane pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you, Adelaide. More than I thought I could love anyone. I love you too. And in 6 days I will be your wife." "In 6 days," Kane agreed, "and every day after that for the rest of our lives." The wedding day dawned clear and cool, the kind of perfect autumn day that made Adelaide believe the universe was blessing their union. She dressed in her cream silk gown, pinned her dark hair up with combs Kane had given her, and studied herself in the small mirror. She looked different from the frightened woman who had stepped off the train 2 months ago. Her skin had bronzed from days in the sun, her hands bore the calluses of hard work, and her eyes held a confidence that had been missing in Boston. She looked like she belonged here, like Wyoming had claimed her as its own. Ruth arrived to help with the final preparations, bringing wildflowers for a bouquet and making sure Adelaide's hair was perfect. "You look beautiful, dear. Kane is a lucky man." "I am the lucky one," Adelaide said, meaning it. "I had given up on finding someone who would accept me as I am." "Kane is one of the good ones," Ruth agreed. "He will take care of you." "We will take care of each other," Adelaide corrected gently, and Ruth smiled. The ceremony was held in the small white church on Main Street, with about 20 people in attendance. Kane stood at the altar in a new suit, his hair neatly combed, looking nervous and eager and so handsome Adelaide's breath caught. She walked down the aisle alone, carrying her bouquet of wildflowers, and when she reached Kane, he took her hand and squeezed it gently. The pastor was an elderly man named Reverend Thomas, who had married most of the couples in Laramie for the past 30 years. He spoke about love and commitment, about the challenges of building a life on the frontier, about the importance of partnership. Then he asked Kane to make his vows. Kane turned to face Adelaide, holding both her hands in his. His voice was steady and clear as he spoke. "Adelaide, I promise to love you every day for the rest of my life. I promise to stand beside you through every challenge, to celebrate every victory, to be the partner you deserve. I promise to listen when you speak, to value your opinions, to never try to change who you are. You are the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I will spend the rest of my days proving myself worthy of you." Adelaide felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. When it was her turn, she spoke from the heart. "Kane, you appeared in my life when I needed you most, and you have shown me what it means to be truly loved. You have never asked me to be anything other than myself, and for that alone I would love you forever. I promise to be your partner in every sense of the word, to work beside you, to support your dreams, to build a life and a family with you. I promise to love you in the good times and the bad, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, until death parts us." Reverend Thomas smiled and pronounced them husband and wife. "Kane, you may kiss your bride." Kane cupped Adelaide's face in his hands and kissed her softly, sweetly, as the small congregation applauded. When they broke apart, both were grinning like fools, and Adelaide felt joy bubbling up inside her like champagne. The reception was held in the church hall, with food provided by various townspeople. There was roasted chicken and potatoes, fresh bread and butter, vegetables from the last harvest, and pies of every variety. Someone produced a fiddle and another man had a banjo, and soon there was music and dancing. Kane swept Adelaide around the floor in a waltz, then a reel, holding her close and whispering in her ear about how beautiful she looked, how happy he was, how he could not wait to start their life together. As the evening wore on, they slipped away from the party and rode out to Kane's ranch, now their ranch. He carried her over the threshold of the house he had built, and Adelaide laughed at the formality of it even as her heart soared. This was home now. Not just the house, but the land, the life they would build, the future stretching out before them like an unwritten book. They spent their wedding night learning each other all over again, with more time and privacy than they had had before. Kane was gentle and patient, making sure Adelaide felt cherished and desired. And when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, Adelaide knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged. The next morning, they woke to the sound of rain on the roof. Kane groaned and pulled Adelaide closer. "We should probably get up and check the animals." "Probably," Adelaide agreed, making no move to leave the warm bed. They lay there for a few more minutes, listening to the rain, before Kane finally sighed and climbed out of bed. "Come on, wife. Time to start our new life." Adelaide loved the way he said wife, like it was the most precious word in the language. She dressed quickly in practical clothes, pinned up her hair, and followed Kane out to the barn. They worked together, feeding the horses and checking on the cattle, moving with an easy coordination that came from weeks of working side by side. Over the next few months, they established a routine. They divided their time between both properties, spending some nights at the original cabin and others at Kane's ranch. They talked about eventually building a new house at Kane's place, something larger that could accommodate the family they planned to have. But for now, they were content to make do with what they had. Winter arrived earlier than expected, bringing snow in mid-November. Adelaide, who had never seen more than a few inches of snow in Boston, was amazed by the way it transformed the landscape into something magical. Kane taught her how to navigate in snowstorms, how to dress in layers, how to break ice in the water troughs so the animals could drink. They spent long evenings by the fire, with Adelaide reading aloud from books while Kane whittled or mended tack. By Christmas, Adelaide knew she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but wanted to be certain before she told Kane. On Christmas morning, after they exchanged simple gifts, she gave him the news. Kane stared at her, his face cycling through shock, joy, and wonder. "A baby. We are going to have a baby." "In July, I think," Adelaide said, watching his reaction carefully. They had talked about wanting children, but the reality of it was different from the abstract idea. Kane let out a whoop and picked her up, spinning her around before remembering himself and setting her down gently. "Sorry, I should not have done that. Are you all right? Do you need to sit down? Should you be working so hard?" Adelaide laughed at his sudden anxiety. "I am fine, Kane. Pregnancy is not an illness. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. But you are not just any woman. You are my woman, and that is our baby." Kane placed his hand on her still flat stomach with such tenderness that Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes. "Our baby," she agreed. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Kane said. "I am terrified and thrilled and already worrying about every possible thing that could go wrong. But mostly, I am just in awe that we made a life together." They spent the rest of the day making plans, talking about names and cribs, and whether they should build the new house before or after the baby arrived. Kane insisted they start on the house immediately, wanting everything perfect for his growing family. Adelaide pointed out that they had 7 months, but Kane was adamant. True to his word, Kane began work on the new house as soon as the weather permitted. He brought in help from town, hiring 2 men to assist with the heavy lifting while Adelaide supervised and helped where she could. The house took shape slowly but surely, rising from the frozen ground like a promise of the future. It was larger than the original cabin, with 2 bedrooms on the ground floor and a loft that could be converted into more bedrooms as the family grew. There was a proper kitchen with a new stove, a sitting room with a large fireplace, and windows that let in plenty of light. As Adelaide's pregnancy progressed, she found herself nesting with an intensity that amused Kane. She sewed curtains for every window, made quilts and blankets, organized and reorganized the kitchen. Ruth gave her advice and old baby clothes from her own children. Other women in town stopped by to offer support and share their own stories of motherhood. Adelaide found herself becoming part of a community in a way she never had in Boston. In the city, her social interactions had been carefully orchestrated, bound by rules of class and propriety. Here, people helped each other because that was what neighbors did. They shared resources, traded skills, and celebrated each other's joys and mourned each other's losses. Adelaide had never felt more connected to other human beings. In late March, they moved into the new house. It still needed finishing touches, but the main structure was complete and weatherproof. Kane carried Adelaide over the threshold again, making her laugh, and then they spent their first night in their new home, lying in bed and listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of settling wood. "This is really ours," Adelaide said, staring up at the ceiling. "We built this." "You sound surprised," Kane said, pulling her close despite the bulk of her belly. "I suppose I am. When I left Boston, I thought I would spend my life alone, scraping by on that little homestead. I never imagined this. A husband who loves me, a beautiful house, a baby on the way. It feels like a dream." "It is real," Kane assured her, "and it is only going to get better." As spring arrived, Adelaide's due date approached. She was huge and uncomfortable, her ankles swollen and her back aching constantly. Kane hovered nervously, trying to do everything for her until Adelaide finally snapped at him to stop treating her like she was made of glass. They had their first real fight, with raised voices and hurt feelings, and then made up an hour later when Kane apologized and admitted he was just scared something would happen to her. "I cannot lose you," he said, holding her carefully. "You and this baby, you are everything to me." "You are not going to lose me," Adelaide said firmly. "I am strong and women have been having babies forever. I will be fine." But as her labor began on a hot July night, Adelaide was not so sure. The pain was unlike anything she had experienced, waves of agony that left her gasping and crying out. Kane sent one of his ranch hands to fetch Ruth and the midwife, then stayed by Adelaide's side, holding her hand and wiping sweat from her forehead. "You can do this," he told her over and over. "You are the strongest person I know. You can do this." Adelaide wanted to scream at him that he had no idea what this felt like, but she did not have the breath. She focused on breathing through the contractions, on pushing when the midwife told her to push, on the promise of holding her baby at the end of this ordeal. 14 hours after her labor began, Adelaide gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The midwife placed him on her chest, and Adelaide stared down at the tiny, red-faced creature in wonder. He had a full head of dark hair and pale blue eyes like his father, and when Kane leaned over to look at his son, tears were streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Kane whispered. "Adelaide, you did it. You gave us a son." "We did it together," Adelaide corrected, though she was too exhausted to say much more. She counted tiny fingers and toes, marveling at the perfect miniature human they had created. They named him Kane Thomas Jennings, after Kane's father and the reverend who had married them. Kane was a good baby, sleeping relatively well and eating with enthusiasm. Kane was besotted from the first moment, spending hours just holding his son and staring at him in amazement. Adelaide, despite her exhaustion, felt a completeness she had never known before. This was her family. Kane and Kane, the house they had built, the land they were taming together. This was everything she had never dared to hope for. The years that followed were full of hard work and joy in equal measure. When Kane was 2, Adelaide gave birth to a daughter they named Abigail Rose. 2 years after that came another son, Kent William. The house that had seemed so large now felt perfectly sized, filled with the noise and chaos of children. Kane expanded the ranch, buying more land and cattle, building up a reputation as a reliable stockman. Adelaide managed the household and the books, proving to have a head for business that helped the ranch thrive. They had their struggles, of course. There were harsh winters and summer droughts, sick animals and lean years. Kane broke his arm falling out of a tree, and Abigail got scarlet fever that left them terrified for weeks until she recovered. Kane hurt his back during a difficult calving and spent a month unable to do heavy work. Adelaide suffered a miscarriage between Abigail and Kent, a loss that left them both grieving. But through it all, they had each other. On the hardest days, when Adelaide felt overwhelmed by the constant demands of children and ranch work, Kane would pull her aside and remind her that they were a team. On the nights when Kane worried about money or weather or any of the 1,000 things that could go wrong, Adelaide would hold him and tell him they would figure it out together. The children grew up wild and happy, learning to ride before they could read, helping with chores as soon as they were old enough to hold a bucket. Kane inherited his father's quiet strength and love of the land. Abigail had her mother's sharp mind and independence, already declaring at age 5 that she was going to be a doctor when she grew up. Kent was the most adventurous of the 3, constantly getting into trouble and coming home with scraped knees and torn clothes. As the children started school in Laramie, Adelaide found herself with a bit more time. She started helping other women in town, teaching reading and basic arithmetic to those who had never had the opportunity to learn. She became known for her kindness and practical advice, the woman you went to when you needed help figuring out how to manage a household on limited resources. Kane became a leader in the community as well, helping to organize cooperative efforts among the ranchers and advocating for better infrastructure. He served on the town council for several years, pushing for improvements to schools and roads. People respected him for his fairness and his willingness to help anyone who needed it, regardless of their circumstances. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kane surprised Adelaide with a trip to Cheyenne. It was the first time they had been away from the children overnight since Kane was born, and Adelaide felt like a young bride again as they checked into a hotel and had dinner at a real restaurant. They walked around the city, window shopping and talking without interruption for the first time in years. "You miss Boston?" Kane asked as they strolled through a park. Adelaide considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss certain things. The theater, the libraries, the variety of shops, but I would not trade our life for anything. What we have built together means more to me than anything I left behind." "No regrets?" Kane asked, echoing the question he had posed on their wedding night. "Not a single one," Adelaide said, repeating her answer from that night. Just that I did not meet you sooner," Kane said, pulling her close. "I would have liked more years with you. We have plenty of years ahead, Adelaide assured him. And think of everything we have done in just 10 years. Imagine what we will accomplish in the next 10 and the 10 after that. Growing old with you, Kane said softly. That is the dream, is it not? Getting to spend a lifetime watching you become even more amazing than you already are. They returned home refreshed and ready to tackle whatever came next. The children were thrilled to see them, talking over each other to share everything that had happened while they were gone. Adelaide hugged each of them tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of horses and hay and home. More years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. Kieran turned 18 and announced he wanted to stay on the ranch, working alongside his father. Kane was thrilled, spending long hours teaching his son everything he knew about cattle and land management. Abigail, true to her childhood declaration, went to nursing school in Cheyenne, determined to become a doctor even though few medical schools accepted women. Kent, restless and curious, talked about heading to California to see the ocean. Adelaide and Kane supported all their children in their choices, even when it meant letting them go. They had built the ranch to provide opportunities, not to trap their children in a life they did not want, and they had each other, which had always been enough. On their 20th anniversary, Kane and Adelaide renewed their vows in the same little church where they had married. Their children attended, along with dozens of friends from town. Adelaide wore her original wedding dress, carefully preserved, and was pleased to find it still fit. Kane had gone gray at the temples, and Adelaide had lines around her eyes from years of squinting in the sun. But when they looked at each other, they saw the same people who had fallen in love over hammers and fence posts 2 decades earlier. 20 years, Kane said during the celebration afterward. 20 years, and I am more in love with you today than I was on our wedding day. That is because you know what you are getting now, Adelaide teased. Back then, I could have turned out to be awful. Impossible, Kane said, using the word that had become their private touchstone. You were already everything. Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes, moved by the echo of those words he had spoken so long ago on a porch in the fading light. And you were the answer to a question I did not know how to ask. They danced late into the night, surrounded by family and friends, celebrating not just their anniversary but the life they had built together. A life that had started with a frightened woman stepping off a train and a lonely cowboy looking for someone to share his dreams. As the years continued to pass, Kane and Adelaide settled into the comfortable rhythm of a long marriage. They knew each other's moods and habits, could communicate with just a glance, and still found joy in the simple pleasure of each other's company. They added on to the house again when Kieran married and brought his wife Emma to live on the ranch. They welcomed grandchildren with delight, spoiling them the way grandparents always did. Adelaide's hair went silver, and Kane developed arthritis in his hands that made certain tasks difficult. They slowed down gradually, letting Kieran take over more of the daily ranch operations while they focused on the things they enjoyed. Kane spent his mornings fishing in the creek that ran through their property. Adelaide tended an enormous garden and continued her work teaching reading to anyone who wanted to learn. On warm evenings, they would sit on the porch they had planned together all those years ago, rocking in chairs Kane had built, watching the sun set over land they had tamed with their own hands. Sometimes they talked, reminiscing about the early days or making plans for the future. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, content just to be near each other. You remember the day we met? Adelaide asked one evening when she was 72 and Kane was 76. You told me I picked a hell of a day to arrive in Laramie. And you told me the train did not run on your schedule, Kane said, laughing at the memory. I thought you were the most stubborn woman I had ever met. And you turned out to be right. Best quality you have, Kane assured her. Well, one of many best qualities. Adelaide reached over and took his hand, their fingers interlacing automatically. She studied their joined hands, both marked by age and hard work, and thought about everything those hands had built together. A home, a family, a life that had exceeded her wildest dreams. I love you, she said simply. I need you to know that. After all these years, after everything we have been through, I love you more than I can possibly express. I know, Kane said, squeezing her hand gently. And I love you just as much. You are still everything, Adelaide. You always have been. They sat there as the stars came out, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting. The ranch would go to their children and grandchildren. The land would endure long after they were gone. But the love they shared was eternal. It had started with fear and hope in equal measure, with a woman who thought she was unlovable, and a man who saw her true value from the very beginning. Years later, when Kane passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 81, Adelaide grieved deeply, but without regret. She had gotten more than 50 years with the love of her life, more than 50 years of partnership and passion and profound companionship. She lived another 3 years after Kane's death, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, telling stories about the early days and the Wild West that was gradually being tamed. When Adelaide died at 75, surrounded by family, her last words were about Kane. "Tell him I am coming," she whispered to Kieran. "Tell him to wait for me." They buried her next to Kane on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a headstone that read Adelaide Jennings, beloved wife, mother, and pioneer. And if you believed in such things, you might say that the wind that rustled through the grass that day carried two voices, laughing and talking as they had done for so many years, finally reunited and together for eternity. The ranch continued to thrive under Kieran's management, passing down through generations of Jennings' children. And every one of them grew up hearing the story of how their great-great-grandmother Adelaide arrived in Laramie with nothing but courage and determination, and how their great-great-grandfather Kane took one look at her and knew she was the one. They heard about the porch conversation where Adelaide cried that she would only disappoint him, and how Kane responded with words that would become family legend. "Impossible. You are already everything." It became a tradition in the Jennings family, a phrase passed down through the years. When someone felt inadequate or afraid, when someone doubted their own worth, there was always someone there to remind them, "You are already everything." It was a legacy of love that had started with two people who found each other in the wild frontier and built something that would last long after they were gone. The homestead where Adelaide first arrived, the cabin where she spent her first lonely night, was preserved as a reminder of humble beginnings. The house Kane and Adelaide built together still stood more than a century later, carefully maintained by descendants who understood its significance. And in Laramie, in the little white church on Main Street, there was a plaque commemorating the couple who had become legendary in local history, the Eastern lady and the lonesome cowboy who proved that true love could flourish even in the hardest soil. Their story was told and retold, embellished and romanticized, but the core remained true. Two people found each other when they both needed someone most. They worked hard, loved deeply, and built a life that honored both their individual strengths and their partnership. They faced challenges and celebrated victories. They raised children who knew they were loved unconditionally. They grew old together, still holding hands and watching sunsets from the porch they had planned together decades before. And at the heart of it all was that moment on the porch, when a frightened woman revealed her deepest fear, and a man who loved her showed her a different truth. Adelaide had been certain she would disappoint anyone who got close to her, that her strength and independence made her unfit for the kind of love she secretly craved. But Kane had seen through her fear to the remarkable woman beneath, and he had given her the greatest gift anyone can give: unconditional acceptance. Impossible. You are already everything. 5 words that changed a life. 5 words that built a legacy. 5 words that proved love was not about changing yourself to fit someone else's expectations, but about finding someone who loved you exactly as you were. Adelaide had been everything Kane needed from the moment they met, and he had been wise enough to recognize it. That recognition, that acceptance, that deep and abiding love became the foundation for everything that followed. Their love story was not perfect. They argued and struggled, faced hardships that tested them, and made mistakes along the way. But they never stopped choosing each other, never stopped working together, never stopped believing in the partnership they had forged in the early days of their marriage. That commitment, that daily choice to love and support each other, was what made their story truly remarkable. In the end, Adelaide and Kane's story was not about the Wild West or frontier hardships or even the ranch they built together. It was about 2 people who found in each other exactly what they had been seeking, even when they had not known what that was. It was about a woman learning she was worthy of love and a man recognizing something precious when he saw it. It was about building a life together one day at a time, with hard work and laughter and profound tenderness. And it all started with a bullet through a saloon window, a frightened woman in a doorway, and a cowboy who walked down the center of the street with quiet confidence. From that moment of chaos came order, from that meeting came love, and from that love came a legacy that endured long after both of them were gone. The Wild West may have been tamed, the frontier may have closed, but the love between Adelaide and Kane Jennings remained wild and untamed and absolutely eternal. They had proven that even in the hardest times, in the harshest conditions, love could not just survive but thrive. They had shown that partnership meant working side by side, supporting each other's dreams, and building something greater together than either could have created alone. Their descendants carried their story forward, passing it down through generations like a treasured heirloom. And every time someone told the story of how Adelaide cried that she would only disappoint Kane, and how he responded with absolute certainty that she was already everything, hearts would warm and eyes would tear up. Because everyone wants to believe that kind of love is possible, that somewhere out there is someone who will see them for who they truly are and love them not despite their flaws, but because those flaws are part of what makes them uniquely themselves. Adelaide and Kane's story was proof that such love existed. They lived it, breathed it, built an entire life around it. And in doing so, they created something that transcended time and place and circumstance. They created a love story for the ages, one that would be told and retold for generations to come, inspiring others to believe in the possibility of finding their own, already everything person. As the sun set over the Wyoming prairie on the day Adelaide was laid to rest beside Kane, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered around the 2 graves. They shared stories and tears and laughter, celebrating 2 lives well lived and a love that had shaped all of them. And as they walked back down the hill toward the ranch house, the house Adelaide and Kane had built together with their own hands and dreams and unstoppable determination, they carried that love with them. It lived on in the way Kieran held his wife Emma's hand, in the way Abigail had fought against social conventions to become a doctor, in the way Kent had followed his dreams to California and built his own life. It lived on in grandchildren who had never met Adelaide and Kane but knew their story by heart. It lived on in the very walls of the house, in the land that stretched out in all directions, in the legacy of hard work and love and unwavering commitment to each other. And somewhere, if you believed in such things, Adelaide and Kane were together again. Perhaps they were sitting on a porch watching another sunset, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing. Perhaps they were young again, meeting for the first time in front of that Laramie saloon with bullets flying and hearts racing. Perhaps they were simply together, which had always been enough. "Impossible," Kane would say, pulling Adelaide close. "You are already everything." And Adelaide would smile, knowing it was true, knowing she had spent her entire life with someone who saw her real worth and never let her forget it. She had come west afraid and alone, certain she was unlovable, convinced she would end up isolated and struggling. Instead, she had found a partner, a love, a life beyond her wildest imaginings. That was the true magic of their story. Not that it was perfect, but that it was real. Not that they never struggled, but that they struggled together. Not that love solved all their problems, but that their love gave them the strength to face any problem that arose. They had built something lasting not because it was easy, but because they chose each other every single day, in big ways and small ways, for more than 50 years. And that choice, that daily recommitment to their partnership, was what made their love story legendary. It was what inspired their descendants and the entire community of Laramie. It was what turned a frightened Boston woman and a lonesome Wyoming cowboy into something more than just two people. They became a symbol of what love could be when you found the right person, when you were brave enough to be yourself, when you worked together instead of apart. The ranch prospered through the generations because it was built on that foundation of partnership and hard work. The Jennings family remained close because they had been taught by example what real love looked like. And the story of Adelaide and Kane's first meeting, that porch conversation, and the 50-plus years that followed became the bedrock of family identity. Every wedding toast in the Jennings family ended with those words, "Impossible. You are already everything." Every anniversary card, every love letter, every romantic gesture somehow circled back to that core truth Kane had recognized from the very beginning. Adelaide had been enough, exactly as she was, and that knowledge had freed her to become even more than she had dreamed possible. As the years turned to decades, and the decades to centuries, the details of Adelaide and Kane's daily life faded somewhat from memory. But the essence of their story remained crystal clear. Two people met and chose each other, built a life together through hard work and unwavering commitment, and created a legacy of love that outlasted them both. They proved that the Wild West was not just about gunslingers and gold rushes and cattle drives. It was also about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about building homes and families in impossible conditions, about finding love in unlikely places. Adelaide Jameson arrived in Laramie, Wyoming in the summer of 1878 with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a heart full of fear. She left this world in the spring of 1932, surrounded by people who loved her, having lived a life of purpose and passion and profound joy. The transformation between those 2 points was not just about circumstances changing. It was about a woman who learned she was worthy of love and a man who never doubted it for a moment. Kane Jennings took a chance on a stubborn Eastern lady who did not know the first thing about frontier life. He saw past her fancy dress and refined speech to the strength beneath, and he bet everything on that strength. It was the best decision he ever made, and he never regretted it for a single day of their long marriage. He died knowing he had lived a full life, loved deeply, and left the world better than he found it. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. Adelaide's intelligence and determination combined with Kane's practical knowledge and steady presence to create something remarkable. They built a ranch that supported not just their family, but employed others. They contributed to their community in countless ways. They raised children who understood the value of hard work and the importance of love. They showed everyone around them what a real partnership looked like. And it all traced back to that moment when Adelaide, terrified of disappointment, tried to warn Kane away. She had expected him to agree, to realize she was right and withdraw his affection. Instead, he had given her the gift of seeing herself through his eyes. In his view, she was not too much or too difficult or too independent. She was already everything he needed and wanted. That shift in perspective changed everything. Adelaide learned that love did not mean making yourself smaller or quieter or more acceptable. It meant finding someone who celebrated you exactly as you were and supported you in becoming even more yourself. Kane taught her that by example, every single day of their marriage. He never asked her to change, never tried to diminish her strength, never treated her as anything less than an equal partner. And Adelaide taught Kane just as much. She showed him that love meant more than providing and protecting. It meant listening and adapting and growing together. She challenged him to think beyond his own experiences, to question assumptions, to be better than he thought he could be. They made each other better, stronger, more complete. That was their legacy, ultimately. Not just the ranch or the children or the years they spent together, but the example they set of what love could be when you got it right. When you chose a partner who saw your true worth. When you committed to working together rather than against each other. When you let love be the foundation for everything else you built. The story of Adelaide and Kane Jennings lived on long after they were gone, passed down through generations, adapted and retold but never forgotten. Because theirs was a love story worth remembering, worth celebrating, worth aspiring to. They had started with nothing but courage and determination and found everything they needed in each other. That was the real magic, the real miracle of their time together. And somewhere in the wind that swept across the Wyoming prairie, in the grass that grew on that hilltop where they rested side by side, in the walls of the house they built, and the hearts of the descendants they left behind, Adelaide and Kane's love endured. Eternal and unchanging, a testament to the power of two people who found each other against all odds and refused to let go. Impossible. You are already everything. Those 5 words became more than just a phrase. They became a promise, a blessing, a reminder that everyone is already everything to someone. You just have to be brave enough to show your true self and patient enough to wait for the person who recognizes your worth. Adelaide found that person in Kane, and Kane found that person in Adelaide, and together they created something that death itself could not diminish. Their love story was complete, with a beginning, middle, and end that felt right and true and satisfying. They lived fully, loved deeply, and left the world richer for their presence. What more could anyone ask for? What better legacy could two people leave behind than proof that love, real love, was worth every risk, every struggle, every moment of doubt? In the end, Adelaide and Kane's story was simple. Two people fell in love and stayed in love for the rest of their lives. But in that simplicity was a profound truth about what it means to really see another person, to recognize their worth, to commit to building something together. That truth resonated through time, touching hearts and inspiring others to believe in the possibility of finding their own, already everything, love. And that was how a frightened woman and a lonely cowboy became legendary, how 5 words became a family motto, How a Wild West romance became a love story for the ages. Not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through the quiet, steady, daily choice to love and be loved exactly as they were. It was, quite simply, everything.